Our third and final presenter is Dr. Youngju Ryu. Dr. Ryu is Associate Professor of Korean Literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. She is the author of the recently published book entitled Writers of the Winter Republic, Literature and Resistance in Park Chung-hee's Korea, as well as the co-editor of the volume Imperatives of Culture, Selected Essays on Korean History, Literature, and Society from the Japanese Colonial Era. Her writings on literature and films of the Korean War, as well as the Vietnam War, has appeared in several peer-reviewed journals, including Positions, Asia Critique, and the Review of Korean Studies. Her talk today is titled From Five Bandits to a Petty Cheat, Media and Satire in South Korean Democratization. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryu.
So, like my colleagues, I'm really honored to be joining an esteemed panel of scholars. I want to thank Director Kim, Associate Director Finch, and also Emily Stern. I don't know if you're here. The crowd has thinned, I see. I was stunned, actually, to hear that this is the first anniversary of the Institute of Korean Studies here at Indiana. Stunned because, in my mind, it's been around for at least 3 years. That's how energetic and creative and full of vitality this institute has been in the very short year. And so I'm looking forward to many more such events. Okay, so I think that even though we didn't coordinate it, the three talks in this panel are kind of responding and building up upon one another. So that very last question that was asked about satire as part of the rallies in 2016, 2017 is very much the subject of my talk. But I will be looking at slightly different time periods. So when I was asked to give a talk for this audience, and given the title, a very nice title, I thought, From Molotov Cocktails to Candle Lights, this experience came immediately back to mind from summer of 2016 when I was on Seoul National University campus. Now this is the so-called Acropolis on SNU campus, a very storied and historic place where the passions of so many student protesters in the 1970s and 80s gathered. In 2016, they were covering over or de-cementing or getting rid of the concrete on the Acropolis. And it was an interesting, there's a history to that. It used to be covered in brick pavers. And in the 1980s, the school removed those brick pavers, I understand. I think Dr. Park has probably a personal experience with this. The reason being, those brick pavers can then be broken into what they call 짱돌, like little pieces of stone, and used as a weapon in students' protests. And so to prevent or preempt that from happening much longer, the university just went and put cement and concrete over the whole thing. And in 2016, they were removing the concrete and cement and putting back the brick pavers. And on the one hand, I mean, aesthetically speaking, I'd much rather walk on brick pavers than unevenly paved, very rapidly paved kind of concrete. At the same time, I couldn't help feeling a little bit sad because it was kind of a testament to how little of a possibility for the kind of protest that had occurred in the 70s and 80s on this campus was now likely to happen. So the administration saw it fit and safe to remove or I mean, the possibility of something like Jangdol had been erased from the realm not only of like practice, but of imagined possibilities of campus life. So that was me in the summer of 2016, and little did I know that there was this coming a few months later, right? Well, good to know that of the many uses that the images of the candlelight protests and revolution can have, there's a commercial value to that image, right? So essentially, 광장의 정치, or what they call the square, politics of the square, had not disappeared, but evolved. And as Dr. Park's presentation made very clear, when you go micro level onto the streets of the square in Gwanghwamun, what you saw were just satire proliferating left and right. Right? And I'm also glad that great minds think alike, and found this Hayahagra to be a particularly interesting flag to point out. So what I want to do is to kind of, in my own way, contextualize this by focusing on the period prior to, just prior to this. Because for good 5 to 7 years, the Korean media had been, maybe it's a strong statement to say censored, but strongly controlled by the conservatives, especially after the establishment of the general cable networks and the removal of the quote-unquote left-leaning board members from MBC and KBS and YTN. So the massive rallies and protests of the 2016 and 2017, as Dr. Chang mentioned, might be a reflection of just how egregious the Park regime was. But I think there was also probably some structure that was built in, right? Some conduits that were being revisited. And we could go back further, but I think we could go back just 2 years to the regime just prior to the Park regime. So that's what I want to do. I want to kind of expand the time frame, and focus on sort of 2 moments prior to the bookends that were given from Molotov cocktails to candlelights. So Molotov cocktails, which I associate with the 1980s student movement, so 1970s, and the candlelight vigils and revolution in 2016 to 17, so going back to 2011 and 2012. And I want to focus specifically on the use of satire during those 2 moments to ask one very simple question. How does something spread? How does something become a meme in today's lingo, but a meme before there was social media? How do masses, multitudes, find something worth spreading? And what are the possible venues by which those things can spread so that they can ultimately gather and consolidate and amplify social force for change? So there's no better place to start than with this, probably. So I'm a little bit upset that the keynote presentation that I prepared in becoming transformed into a PowerPoint has lost lots of pretty fonts. But in any event, for a sense of what Kim Ji-ha once meant to the South Korean democratization movement, we might imagine ourselves at one of these rallies. And even though I don't have a photograph of it, but at the Catholic Center in Wonju in January of 1979, at an event that bore Kim Ji-ha's name, was called Night of Kim Ji-ha's Literature, which was held in the very last year of Park Chung-hee's authoritarian regime, as the violence of his Yushin administration was escalating to a fever pitch, the event gathered people in the name of a poet who was spending a better part of the decade in prison as a political prisoner. As this night of Kim Ji-ha literature wore on, another poet took to the stage to recite a lengthy verse dedicated to Kim Ji-ha. And I'll read a part of it. No one's child, no one's father. You are Ji-ha, the people's poet. Ji-ha, the nation's young revolutionary. Ji-ha, the comrade of the conscientious in the 6 continents. Ji-ha, the brother of the just throughout world history. Your loneliness is a nation's. Your despair is a people's. Your will is ours, and we are you. Okay? So in this poem, which was written by Ko-eun, himself a huge name, among the most dissident poets of the entire Yushin era, this poem turned Kim Ji-ha's name into an invocation, no fewer than 26 times. What Ko-eun thus made clear was that Kim Ji-ha was no longer the single physical body incarcerated by the increasingly paranoid dictator. His loneliness, now the nation's, and his despair, the people's, Kim had become the proper name for all who suffer privation and persecution for the sake of justice and conscience. A martyr, in other words, and as such, a potent call for revolution. So Kim Ji-ha was a prophet, and I would say a gospel of democracy, as revealed in the way this particular poem became an anthem for an entire group, generation of dissidents in Korea in the 1980s, long after Kim Ji-ha was on trial for writing. But before he became this prophet for the gospel of democracy, he really entered the public imagination as a satirist. The writer of this great poem called Five Bandits, which turned those powers that be into 5 bandits and charged that the Park Chung-hee regime, the conglomerate, assembly mutt, top civil serpent, and general and chimp, in the beautiful translation we have by Brother Anthony of this poem, were not in the service, not in the business of serving the people, but in the business of robbing the people. And because these people were in service to the authoritarian ruler, then the poem became a very clear indictment, an early example of leftivism, as we might say today, in the Trump era. I'm not going to go into textual analysis of this poem, which I've done elsewhere in the book that Susan was so nice to mention. But I want to point out one other thing that's quite overlooked about this poem, which is that it took news items that were beginning to fade and recirculated them. So the poem itself became kind of a means, a medium for concentrating and recirculating news. And the news included the famous saccharin smuggling case of 1966, which led to Samsung founder Lee Byung-chul's resigning from his post. But also for those of us who might remember the death of a young woman who turned out to be a very high-priced escort, and in the black book that she carried in her bag were names of some of the highest men in the country, including the 4 men who walk in and out of the Blue House every day. I mean, obviously the president, Park Chung-hee, but also his chief of staff then, Lee Hoo-rak, his chief of security, Park Jong-gyu, and also the prime minister, Chung Il-kwon. And it turned out that she actually had a love child. And now, after many years, it seems very likely that Chung Il-kwon was actually the father. So the death of this woman was a political scandal. It made the news, but then it became revisited in Five Bandits. The collapse of Wau apartments that Dr. Park has written elegantly about, which was kind of a culmination of all the different ways that the drive for rapid industrialization and urbanization was completely corrupt. So the collapse of these apartments in 1970, like months after they were first constructed, revealed that, where you need, 20, 30 rebars, the building had only a couple. And the money saved from kind of using skimping on the materials for construction had actually greased the pole, right? Leading to those Five Bandits. So I think it's interesting to think about Ojok or Five Bandits not simply at the level of textual analysis and the satire it delivers, but as medium. And that aspect of its story is amplified by the fact that when it first appeared in this magazine, A World of Thought, 사상계 in 1970, the government kind of let it go. And it was only when it reappeared a month later as part of a 민주 전선, or the Democratic Front, which was sort of the bulletin for Kim Young-sam's party, 신민당, that it became, okay, now the government has to really step in and keep it from spreading further, right? So then that's when the poet, his publisher, the publisher of the magazine 사상계, they were all rounded up and tried in court. Okay, so that fantastic story. I want to leave it for now and just fast forward many, many, many decades to that period just before the candlelight protests of 2016 and 17 really exploded. And that is the presidency of Lee Myung-bak, whom Koreans call simply MB. Right? So this is one of the now very fast forgotten episodes, because there are so many episodes that are so unsavory, and this is relatively minor. But I want to talk about it because it kind of reveals a number of different things. So of the many unsavory allegations that have been raised about MB, none is more dismaying to the Korean people, I think, than the most venial of them all. In October of 2011, a story broke about a funny arrangement the Blue House had made with the president's son over some real estate. Together, they had purchased a large property in Naekokdong, an area on the southern outskirts of Seoul, which was expected to undergo huge redevelopment. The property was to be the site of the president's post-retirement home, which means that the government ends up paying for it. Right? Blue House, primarily in order to accommodate the security detail that will follow him there, but also to allow the former first family to continue to live in a dignified manner befitting their changed status after he retires from his presidential office. They would end up kind of building this place, maintaining it, paying for it, in other words. The president argued that the renovation of his original residence in Gangnam and the acquisition of security facilities in the expensive area in Gangnam would be too much. And so this new property would be a better site for his future. And Blue House was responsible for acquiring the land for security facilities and footing the bill for all construction costs. The property in Naekokdong, however, was purchased not in the president's name, but in the son's, with a loan made by mortgaging the president's original house in Nonhyundong. So here's the son, right? Now, this is a commonly used technique among Korea's upper middle class to avoid paying taxes on a transfer of estate from a parent to a child. The highly irregular contract also revealed that the president's son had paid 20.74% of the purchase price, but owned 54% of the property, while the Blue House had paid the rest and still owned only 46%. Since the real estate was acquired from a single seller in a single transaction, it became clear that the Blue House had paid a substantially above market price for its share of the land, while the president's son had paid substantially below the market price for his share. A National Assemblyman from the opposition party estimated that the entire deal had cost Korean taxpayers $500,000 at least. So what made the case so depressing was not that a crime of monstrous magnitude had been committed, but that a relatively petty profit had been sought with such ingenuity and attention to detail. An elaborate transaction had been concocted to put $500,000 more in the bank of a president who is already so fabulously wealthy, or his son. Right? So much time and energy of the Blue House staff had been spent trying to save the president or his son the fair share of inheritance tax that was theirs to pay. To be sure, presidents abusing power and benefiting their children in material ways, or presidents' children abusing their influence to benefit themselves, is not an uncommon practice for those of us who know Korean political history well. But this, the means and the ends seemed to have been inverted, and which is what made it so painful. Whereas corruption had always been an unfortunate byproduct of power in a political system that concentrates so much of that power in its highest office, it had never been so blatantly an end in itself. It was as though the presidential office had been sought and attained for the express purpose of materially benefiting very specific persons, all related to the president by personal ties, his immediate family, his brothers, his in-laws, his aides, members of his very prominent church, his high school and college classmates, with each of these persons also exercising the same logic, so that personalism irradiated outward and created a complex web of influence. The Nakkomsu incident and so many others like it, that consumed the work days and work nights of the highest political office of the land, seem to be motivated neither by a political vision, nor a public cause, nor even the raw desire for power. Looking for traces of the Kantian statesman or the general in the MB Blue House, the Korean found instead a mere commercial spirit operating at its purest. So it is in this context that we can understand the observation repeatedly made by Kim Ojun, the political podcaster whose laughter you will hear shortly in this presentation, that the president is a very 사사로운 man, which it translates to very personal man, and that he had turned the Korean government and by extension the Korean taxpayers into his personal revenue stream. Lee Myung-bak, in keeping with a staunchly neoliberal philosophy, may have been the first president in Korean history to have privatized the very office of the president. And it is in some ways in reaction to the privatization that actually Park Geun-hye was voted into power. She was seen as somebody who was completely without personal ties. No husband, no child, married to the country as it were. And yet it turned out the Korean public learned soon enough how wrong they were. Okay, so then moving on to how all of this came out. The Nakkomsu deal might never have come to light had it not been for an investigative report in the liberal weekly 시사인. But this report might never have attracted much attention had it not been for a political podcast that delivered the allegations of presidential misdemeanors to millions of Korean listeners on their smartphones, and to a lesser extent their laptops and desktop computers. The podcast was wrapped up in a mix of ribald humor, wealth of details, and creative guesswork. 나는 꼼수다, which I'll just call Nakkomsu for short, and that's how it's called in Korean society, which translates to I am a petty cheat, had been launched 5.5 months earlier as a brainchild of Kim Ojun's, this guy right here, an early political satirist on the internet, and the founder of the ever-contrarian 딴지일보, which can be translated as a daily tackle. The basic concept of the podcast was simple. 4 men, all losers under the conservative MB administration, and united in their deep contempt of the president, would get together once a week in a basement recording studio, shoot the breeze about the current affairs without a prepared script, and compare notes on political gossip. All 4 would gather information, but each would play a different role. So Jung Bong-ju, a former representative of the National Assembly, was a political insider, providing what in sports might be called the color commentary. In the presidential race of 2007, Jung had played the role of the so-called BBK sniper, charging the then candidate MB of defrauding thousands of investors through a capital management company called BBK, which will return shortly in the presentation. The prosecutors cleared MB of any wrongdoing, and Jung suffered a consequent backlash and narrowly lost his National Assembly seat. Kim Young-min, a political commentator and a former radio program producer, oversaw the technical aspects of production while also doing impressions of various political figures for added comic effect. Ju Jin-woo, a reporter for Sisain, who had been the one to break the Naegokdong story, did much of the detective work necessary to fill in the details. Kim Ojun presided over it all, piecing the scenarios together, translating the details of complicated stories into the colloquial, conversational language of every man, and infusing the whole proceeding with this ineffable laughter. The recorded conversation would be shortened to 90 to 120 minutes on the average, and the sound file uploaded on iTunes and its Android equivalent. So this is 2011. So, we're in technological backwaters compared to today. Because government regulation had not yet caught up with advancements in communication technology, the podcast platform still remained a blind spot in the otherwise pretty tightly controlled media landscape of the post-2008, the beef mad cow disease protests. The podcast thus opened up a medium for averting and subverting state censorship, as Samizdat had once done in a darker time. Cursing and laughing at will, gleefully flouting the regulations that would bind regular broadcasts as they made mockery of the president and his cronies, the 4 men of Nakkomsu towed the line between fearless investigative reporting and conspiracy theory. And this formula proved to be explosive. The podcast went viral, and Nakkomsu became a veritable phenomenon as it reached the top of global iTunes charts. On November 1, 2011, for example, the New York Times reported that Nakkomsu's weekly sessions logged as many as 2 million downloads and become a platform for a grab bag of miscellaneous political programming. And so here, the top news, you have all of these episodes, all of this in red is the Nakkomsu episodes, the audio files that were uploaded on iTunes. Nakkomsu provided in-depth evaluations of opposition politicians on the eve of major elections, recast doubt on controversies of national importance about which the mainstream press and television had provided only a partial view, if at all, including, for example, the sinking of Cheonan, and dogged every move of the president's inner circle. Perhaps in its most significant electoral victory, Nakkomsu helped to unseat the conservative mayor of Seoul, nicknamed Little MB, for the way, this is Oh Se-hun, for the way he was gunning for the presidential office by transforming the urban landscape of Seoul. It then helped discredit the National Assembly representative and a major star of the Conservative Party who sought to replace him. This was a woman named Nakkomsu, and essentially the podcast kind of suggested that she was a client at a very exclusive dermatology clinic and was paying like $100,000 a year for the membership. And then helped unseat her, and Park Won-soon, who is the mayor today, defeated her in the election. So on account of Nakkomsu's explosive popularity, the four men became major celebrities, even though some of them ended up really suffering for that fame, including this guy Jung Bong-ju right here, the BBK sniper who actually served a jail term on what I think was essentially a 괘씸죄, right? So what was it about this experiment that was so successful? Okay. So the mastermind and kind of a philosopher behind the podcast is this guy, Kim Ojun. And he published a book, a best-selling book, called Just Politics, No Excuses, in Korean, 닥치고 정치. He argued a couple of things about this podcast revolution. In launching Nakkomsu, he was, quote, taking on mano a mano all of the following: the three major newspapers, conservative; the three major television networks, conservative; the Blue House, the prosecutor's office, and the National Intelligence Service, which was the biggest criminal of them all, right? In a country where the major media outlets had been monopolized by the right for a good 100 years, even during the decade of the progressive interlude. 조선일보 was a venerable enemy of the 노무현 regime and helped bring Nomuhyun down in the end. Nakkomsu would create an alternate system of message circulation. This is what Kim Ojun said. Kim Ojun identified three key elements of Nakkomsu that would enable it to take off and revolutionize the very terrain of political engagement in South Korea. The first was medium. With the arrival of the smartphone and social media, a new hybrid platform was being created which would allow receivers of information to simultaneously become active, voluntary distributors of that information. The provider of content or the originator of the message no longer needed to control the system of distribution, the newspapers, television networks, magazines, and the internet portals, in order to ensure that its message find the desired number of eyeballs. The democratization of information enabled by SNS would allow further proliferation of those contents deemed valuable or entertaining by the receiver, thereby eliminating the material basis for the conservatives' monopoly on the physical channels of message distribution. The qualities required of the content generator in this new communication environment was insight and judgment to see what will qualify as good content to whom, backbone to hold fast to that judgment, and patience to wait for the content to enter the proper distribution system. Anyone seeking to harness SNS to a political agenda had to be mindful of the importance of voluntary, spontaneous action on the part of the information receiver and the content consumer. A given content, Kim Ojun said, quote, becomes spam when advertised, but information when spread spontaneously. Okay, second was language. Invoking the famous Zen teaching about how a finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. So the Zen koan goes something like, why are you looking at my finger when you should be looking at the moon? The finger is simply pointing to the moon, right? Don't look at my finger. Kim Ojun made an argument in a characteristically irreverent fashion about the relationship between form and content that would determine whether something gets retweeted or not. Point to the moon with your dick, and people will look at your dick and not at the moon, is what he said, right? Excuse my vulgarity. Now, this is a message that we, literature specialists, have been preaching for a long, long time, although probably not with this kind of verb. A consumable political content had to be in the language of the popular. In order to have its message enter wide circulation, the South Korean left had to find a way to shed its rhetoric of enlightenment, which characterized its 1980s sacrosanct movement culture. And along with it, the attitude of solemnity that it had demanded from the listener just by the mode of its address. So think back to Kim Ji-ha as a prophet, as a preacher of the gospel of democracy, and all the different ways that activists who lost their lives or gave up their lives in the 1980s were addressed as 열사, or the righteous, right? So that's the kind of language that for Kim Il-jung was a death knell to the further spread of the left movement. So in the proud tradition of resistance, born of life and death struggle against the authoritarian rule in the 1980s, the tradition to which the South Korean left still owes much allegiance, language had been heroic and ennobled, or didactic and abstract. In either case, it was rigid and self-important. It had to be so, since in order to resist dictatorship while existing as an antithesis of the authoritarian state, what historian Lee Nam-il called the counter-public sphere, 운동권, or the resistance, had to share the idiom of power. But already in 2008, fiction writer Bang Min-gyu had foreseen how unbearable any kind of stodgy language would become to the Korean public. Language that is incapable of entering into unholy unions, to be reborn in freshly clever permutations. Dr. Park mentioned the world of otaku or 덕후 culture. It's all about these unholy unions, making neologisms that are smarter and smarter and cleverer. In his short story, Four Dragons, Bang Min-gyu, through the mouth of the protagonist, bemoans the end of a time when language could move the listener by the sheer force of its weight. I quote, "The age of heroes was over. Behold the dawn of the age of girls." Incidentally, the age of girls, or 소녀시대, is also the name of the famous K-pop group SNSD, or Girls' Generation. Plasticity rather than rigidity, and self-mockery rather than self-importance, such are the characteristics required of language in the age of girls, when politicians must make their appeal to the public, not on debate floors or campaign stumps, as the legendary DJ did. Forever be enshrined in history, his campaign stump speeches. But on variety shows. So Ancheolsu became famous when he appeared on the variety show Knee Drop Guru, or 무릎 박도사. Moon Jae-in and Park Geun-hye and Ancheolsu again, all of them appeared on the variety show Healing Camp, etc., etc. Okay, third was the attitude, a kind of sensibility that might be called a swag factor. Never beg for attention, Kim Il-jung argued. Information in the era of SNS is discovered, not disseminated. And do not hope or expect to gain anything, to benefit personally from the content you generated. It is this hope for personal benefit that makes you hostage to the establishment, since it is the establishment that controls the distribution of resources. And above all else, he says, 쫄지 마, right? Or don't be cowed. Don't be cowed, 쫄지 마, in fact, became Nakkomsu's mantra, repeated at the end of every episode as an ending theme of sorts. The prescription had much to do with Kim Il-jung's understanding of the plight of the common man in the MB era. If the military dictators of the past could be likened to thugs, then MB, Im Young-bak, was a con man. Both are out to rob you blind, but one does so by threatening to gouge your eyes out or cut off your limb. but the other, the con man, sweet talks you into investing in a financial scheme that you know deep down is too good to be true. The con works by assuming the existence in you of petty greed and devising a plan to bring it out of you under a cover of respectability. For this reason, the victim of thuggery may feel anger, but not much shame, while the victim of a con feels more shame than anger. Whether he acknowledges it or not, the latter knows that his basest desires conspired with the swindler against his own good. For Kim Ojun, the truly deleterious consequence of the con MB has pulled on the Korean people was that they felt as though they have no choice but to define their existence as conatus, that they have internalized a big other that recognizes them only as human animals rather than human subjects. And the distinction is values. Against such a backdrop, Nakkomsu's mantra, 쫄지 마, don't be cowed, is more than a mantra. It's a maxim and an imperative and a call for repudiation. 쫄지 마, refuse to be what the MB era says you are and must ever be. That is to say, a petty cheat. So if there is a single truth, then Nakkomsu's relentless indictment of the president reinforced over and over again, it is a truth already announced at the very outset of their program and the experiment that the president is a petty cheat. For Nakkomsu's men hunched over their microphones in their bunker, this knowledge was master key that opened all doors, that solved all puzzles, that made everything seemingly incomprehensible issuing from the Blue House intelligible. The allegations, investigations, and detective fictions that Nakkomsu revealed to the world emanated from that single premise. The insistence on that truth, however, was simultaneously an attempt to break the specularity of the relationship that the president Lee Myung-bak forged with the Korean voting public to gain access to his private Blue House in the first place. For the actions of the petty cheat who no longer needs a cover for his crookery may no longer be venial, but monstrous. And that indeed is what happened to MB during the 5 years of his presidential rule. I know I'm running over. Can I take 5 more minutes? Yeah? Okay. So one way to think about Nakkomsu, let's see if I can bring this down, is that they're a kind of working off of a fan culture, and it should be located in the intersection between politics and entertainment in many ways. So online fan clubs have been a familiar feature of South Korean political landscape since Roh Moo-hyun, and of course Park Geun-hye was the one who had the biggest fan club of them all. But I think a Nakkomsu phenomenon really brought this home. So the excessiveness of Nakkomsu's popularity suggested that Nakkomsu exceeded the available frames of reference. A particularly brilliant Korean scholar named Seo Young-chae has talked about this using Lacanian terms and the Lacanian formula for sexuation. And very briefly, I'll say it goes something like, the female formula of sexuation uses the logic of not all, right? Where the masculine formula reads something like, there exists an entity such that this entity is not subject to the phallic function. For all entities, X is submitted to the phallic function. In contrast, the feminine formula reads something like, there does not exist an entity that is not submitted to the phallic function. Not all of X is submitted to the phallic function. So what does that mean? The masculine formula is a logic of exception insofar as it posits a universal and an exception to that universal. All entities are subject to the phallic function. In other words, castration arising from the Oedipal situation in an incest taboo, as a price of entering the symbolic order, right? But there is one entity that is an exception to that rule, and that's the dictator, that's the primal father who has full access to Jusans and to all the women, etc. The exception, moreover, is constitutive of the universal in that the masculine subject's fantasy of the one who can enjoy all the women in the tribe, including the mother, the sister, the daughter, is what allows him to accept the fact that he can't and endure the otherwise unbearable reality of castration. And the figure of the sovereign has been analyzed in political discourse in this way. Now, about MB, okay, I'll read this part. The figure of the sovereign has been analyzed in terms of this logic, and the dictator is a commonly analyzed figure of the modern-day primal father. In the Korean political context, I would argue that Park Jung-hee would be the locus classicus for the primal father, for such a figure of exception, right? Of plenitude that underwrites the continuance of exceptional plenitude that underwrites the continuance of universal privation. In post-authoritarian Korea, however, I would argue that it is Lee Gon-hee, the erstwhile head of Samsung, and the other Chaebol figures like him that carry this fantasy of the primal father. The central problem with the MB presidency was that while it operated under the logic of exception, MB could not adequately occupy the place of the primal father in the fantasy. Because he's not fully a 괴물, he's a 속물탄 괴물. His monstrosity is the effect of his continuing to act like a poor man, still in the process of private wealth accumulation, when he actually is in this position of power. Okay, so Nakkomsu's relentless expose of all the ways a president remains faithful to the essence of who he is, which is a small man in the Confucian sense of the term, followed a different strategy, a different logic, framed as a couple of negative statements, one of which was a double negative, the feminine formula. The logic of not all was imminent and non-universalizable. It is also built upon the modest but terribly important insight that two negatives do not make a positive. There is no exception to the lack, but if there is still someone who is not submitted to the lack, he is not someone who has gained the outside, but someone who continues to cry from within the reality of castration, but not all, not all. It's the voice of an intellectual with no education, 무학의 지식인, is what Kim Ojun calls himself, right? Who does not so much as oppose the mere commercial spirit that motivates MB, but invalidates it altogether, right, from a different ground. At the same time, it is the voice of the 잡놈, ruffian, in the traditional sense, but chap is also mixing and convergence in the digital age, right, and a particularly important value for that reason. The voice of 잡놈, a ruffian who follows no rules of polite society, a bastard who boasts no accepted genealogy, a tramp who can afford to be courageous because he has nothing to lose. That not all of his very existence reveals the wealthy man to be poor, common etiquette to be mere pretense, and punctures a hole in the fantasy of developmental plenitude. Right? The MB era, the age of girls, the age of BBK, Four Rivers, and Cheonan gave that voice a name and conferred on it a specific timbre. And here, I will get to this and say, have you read? Well, 쫄지마, the voice cries, and then it breaks out into laughter that is rowdy and raucous and deeply satisfying. And the laughter is not, can I play it? Okay. It's not playing? Okay, so it's not playing, but you can look it up, right? All right, so that's sort of Nakkomsu and the podcast revolution it started in a nutshell. I'm sorry that I had to rush through to the end, but I think I could probably do a coda. So at the end of the MB era, when Park Geun-hye won the election instead of Moon Jae-in in 2012, This group totally went sort of underground, kind of. But so many of the issues that were brought out in the Nakkomsu podcast, and which were then dismissed as kinds of conspiracy theory, have since come out in daylight as being absolutely on the money, including the way the National Intelligence Agency supported and paid for all of these people to create public opinion online in favor of a particular candidate Park at the time. How resource diplomacy ended up buying a company that is essentially worth $1 for, what, $1 billion, right? And it's a controversy that's continuing today. And this one, BBK, right? The fraud, the huge fraud that Lee Myung-bak, the president, committed prior to becoming a candidate for the presidency, and which was like hushed up and swept under the rug. Now this Nakkomsu group has continued to keep this issue alive and has recently turned it into a very powerful meme, right, called Who Owns DAS, or DAS, Who Owns DAS, which is a kind of a company related to, which had very kind of suspicious dealings with BBK. It's rumored to be actually owned by Lee Myung-bak, and he's in the process of transferring the ownership to his son. And to end with satire, which was in the topic of this presentation, I thought in honor of Bruce and of the season, the post-season, I would share an image of how the Korean netizens have used satire to circulate this question, but who owns DAS, right? So here's Justin Turner getting interviewed after his historic home run, and the Korean netizens have put the question here. They've subtitled it this way: Justin, there's a question going around Korea right now, and the question is, who do you think owns DAS? Right? Okay. All right. Thank you.